The morning Annie Wallace scraped the last cup of flour from the bottom of the sack, she did not cry. She had used up all her tears 3 months prior, standing over a fresh mound of dirt at the edge of the property, where her husband Thomas lay buried beneath a plain wooden cross. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Kansas plains had been merciless that year. The grasshoppers had come through in biblical swarms during the summer, stripping the fields clean as a whistle, and then the drought followed like a second punishment from a sky that had forgotten how to be kind. The small homestead Annie had shared with Thomas on the outskirts of Caldwell, Kansas, sat on 30 acres that had once promised everything, and now promised nothing but another winter of hardship. The house itself was modest to the point of being apologetic: 2 rooms separated by a thin plank wall, a stone hearth that ate wood faster than she could gather it, and a porch that sagged on one side where the post had rotted clean through 2 springs ago. Thomas had been a good man. Not a remarkable man, but a steady and decent one, the kind who rose before the sun and worked until his hands bled and never once complained about the state of things. He had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1869 with a head full of hope and a second-hand plow, and he had found Annie working as a seamstress in Caldwell and had courted her with the kind of quiet persistence that eventually wore down her sensible resistance. They had married in the spring of 1870, and for 3 years they had built something small but real together. Then the fever came in August, the kind that swept through the settlements like fire through dry grass, and in 10 days it took Thomas from her, leaving Annie at 26 years old with a failing homestead, a milk cow named Bess who was getting too old to give much, a lenta full of dwindling supplies, and a grief so heavy it had physical weight. She had survived the first 2 months by selling Thomas's second horse to a rancher named Perkins who lived 7 miles east. She had survived the 3rd month by trading her good wool coat, the blue one Thomas had given her for their second Christmas, to the general store in Caldwell for a sack of cornmeal and some salt pork. Now it was October, the coat was gone, the salt pork was gone, the cornmeal was gone, and she was standing in her cold kitchen in the gray morning light, looking at the single cup of flour she had scraped from the very bottom of the sack and trying to decide what to do with it. She could make a thin gruel of it and eat it herself, stretching it across 2 or perhaps 3 small meals. That was the practical choice. That was what survival demanded. But somewhere in the deep and quiet center of her, in the place where Annie Wallace had always lived beyond the reach of practicality, a different impulse stirred. She thought of the man who had moved into the old Harmon place 3 weeks ago. She did not know him. She had seen him only twice, once from across the road when she was bringing Bess in from the field, and once at a distance when he was hauling timber to repair the barn on that property. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his coat, and he had been working alone both times she had seen him. No wife visible, no children. Just a man and his labor, which in this part of Kansas in 1873 was not an unusual sight. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from or what had brought him to the Harmon place, which had been sitting empty since old Jacob Harmon passed the previous winter. She only knew that he was a stranger, and that he appeared to be alone, and that something in her, some deep-wired instinct toward human decency that not even starvation had managed to extinguish, told her that a man laboring alone on a failing property might be just as hungry as she was. She stood for a long time in front of the hearth, turning the idea over in her mind the way she might turn a stone over to see what lived beneath it. It was foolish. It was the kind of gesture that had no room in a season as brutal as this one. And yet she found herself building up the fire, heating the small amount of water she had carried from the well that morning, measuring out the flour with the precision of a woman who understood that this was, in every meaningful sense, the last of what she had. She had a small amount of salt and a scrape of lard left in the tin. She worked the dough with hands that were rougher than they had been when Thomas was alive, kneading it on the wooden board with a methodical patience that was almost meditative. The loaf she shaped was small, barely enough to fill a man's 2 hands, but she formed it carefully, as if the care she put into it might carry some message beyond the bread itself. She set it in the cast iron pan and put it over the fire, and she sat in Thomas's chair and watched it bake, listening to the wind move across the prairie outside with that long, low, unceasing moan that she had never quite gotten used to. When the loaf was done, she wrapped it in a clean cloth, her last clean cloth, as it happened, and she put on her thin jacket and walked the 1/4 mile down the rutted dirt road to the old Harmon place. The house there was in better repair than she had expected. The stranger had clearly been working hard in the weeks since his arrival. Fresh boards had replaced the rotted ones on the front steps, and the porch railing had been rebuilt, and someone had recently rehung the front door so that it sat square in its frame. But there was no smoke from the chimney, and no horse at the post, and no light in the windows. The man was not home. Annie stood on those fresh-built steps for a moment that stretched in both directions, behind her into a long season of loss, ahead of her into a future she could not see clearly. And then she set the loaf down on the top step, still wrapped in the cloth, and she walked back to her own house. She did not allow herself to look back. She thought, as she walked, about how strange it was that the act of giving away the last of something could feel like the most dignified thing she had done in months. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the winter that was coming. She thought, with a clarity that came sometimes in moments of true desolation, that she might not survive it, not from despair, but simply from mathematics. There was not enough food, not enough fuel, not enough of anything to carry her through to spring, and she had no one left to ask for help without it costing her what remained of her pride. She sat in Thomas's chair again when she got home, in the cooling kitchen that smelled faintly of the bread she had just given away, and she put her hands in her lap and she waited, though she did not know what she was waiting for. She did not have to wait as long as she feared. It was the following afternoon when she heard the sound of wagon wheels on the road, a heavy, deliberate sound, the sound of something substantial moving slowly through the mud that the night's cold rain had made of the track. Annie was at the window before she had consciously decided to move, and what she saw made her grip the windowsill hard enough to whiten her knuckles. There was a wagon coming toward her house. Not passing it, as the rare wagons on this road tended to do, but turning off the road toward her gate with the calm purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The wagon was loaded. She could see that from even this distance, loaded high with sacks, with crates, with things she could not yet identify but which had, in their sheer volume, the appearance of abundance. And driving the wagon was the stranger from the Harmon place. He pulled the team to a stop at her gate, and he set the brake and climbed down with the practiced ease of a man who had been climbing down from wagons his entire life. He was taller than she had registered from a distance. Perhaps 6 feet, perhaps a little more, with a build that spoke of genuine physical labor rather than the posed strength of a man with something to prove. His coat was heavy canvas, worn at the elbows, and his hat was the kind of wide-brimmed plainsman's hat that was nearly a necessity out here. He had a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes, she could see them now as he came through the gate, that were a warm and surprising brown, the color of creek water over smooth stone. He was carrying something. He had pulled a sack of flour from the wagon bed, and he had it balanced over one shoulder as easily as another man might carry a coat, and he was walking toward her porch with the same quiet determination that she imagined he brought to everything. Annie opened the door before he could knock. For a moment they simply looked at each other. The wind moved between them, carrying the cold smell of rain and earth and the approaching winter. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, but not rough. There was something careful in it, something that spoke of a man who chose his words deliberately. "I found your bread on my step this morning. I want to say that was one of the kindest things that has been done for me in a very long time. I thought I should return the kindness." Annie opened her mouth and then closed it again. She was not, by nature, a woman who was easily rendered speechless, but she found that the sight of that flour sack, and the wagon behind him loaded with she did not yet know what, and the plain sincerity in the stranger's brown eyes, had temporarily deprived her of her usual composure. "You do not have to do that," she finally managed. "I know I do not have to," he said, with the faintest trace of something that was almost a smile. "I wanted to. May I bring these up?" She stepped back from the doorway. "Please," she said, "come in." He came in not just with the flour, but over the course of the next half-hour with a succession of things that Annie Wallace could not have listed without her voice shaking. 2 more sacks of flour, a sack of cornmeal, a tin of coffee, a slab of cured bacon wrapped in paper, a jar of molasses, a bag of dried beans, a small crate with 4 jars of preserved vegetables, the kind that had been put up carefully by someone who knew what they were doing, a bundle of candles, a sack of oats, and at the very end, almost as an afterthought, a paper bag of hard candies that he set on the table with a look that was half apology, as if he was aware that sweets were not practical and had brought them anyway. Annie stood in the middle of her kitchen, watching this man carry the winter's survival through her door in load after load, and she felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It was not quite hope, though it contained hope. It was something older and more complicated than either of those things, the feeling of being seen by another person in a moment when you believed yourself to be invisible. When the last of it was stacked against the wall and settled into place, the stranger straightened up and turned to look at her. He pulled his hat from his head and held it in both hands in the way that men did when they were aware that they were in a woman's house and wanted to be respectful about it. "My name is Cornelius Brooks," he said. "I have taken up the Harmon place for the winter, and I believe we are neighbors." "Annie Wallace," she said. "I am sorry I did not come to introduce myself when you arrived. Weeks have been difficult." "I understand," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of prying or of the particular kind of sympathy that was really just curiosity in disguise, made Annie feel that perhaps he genuinely did understand, in the way that people who have experienced difficulty themselves understand the difficulty of others without needing to have it explained. "Will you sit?" she said. "I cannot offer you much, but I can offer you coffee." She paused, looking at the tin he had brought. "I can offer you coffee now, in fact." That almost smile again, warmer this time. "I would be glad of it," Cornelius Brooks said, and he sat down in the chair nearest the hearth, not Thomas's chair, she noticed, though he could not have known which was Thomas's, and he held his hat in his lap and looked at the fire. She put the water on and measured the coffee with the particular pleasure of someone who has been without it for long enough to have missed it. And as the water heated, she asked him, because it seemed the natural and polite thing to ask, where he had come from. "Missouri, originally," he said, "though I have been moving around some years. I was in Texas for a while, and before that Colorado." He turned the hat in his hands. "I heard the Harmon land was sitting empty and that it was good bottom soil. I thought I would try it." "It is good soil," Annie said. "Or it was. The grasshoppers took most everything this summer." "I know," he said. "I saw the damage when I arrived. I'm hoping that next spring will be different." "Everyone out here is hoping that," Annie said with a candor that surprised even herself. "It is the primary occupation of the prairie, hoping that next spring will be different." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, but it contained, she thought, a measure of appreciation. "And you," he said, "how long have you been here?" She told him in the brief and factual way that grief had taught her to discuss itself. Thomas, the 3 years of building, the fever in August, the winter approaching. She did not embellish and she did not minimize, and he listened with the full and undivided attention of a man who was genuinely interested, which was becoming, she was learning, a characteristic of his. "I am sorry about your husband," he said when she had finished. "Thank you," she said. Then, because honesty was the only currency she had left that had not been spent. "He was a good man. Not a complicated man, but good. The land was his dream more than it was mine, but I made it my own. I'm not sure I know how to stop now, even when the mathematics of it seem impossible. The mathematics of it seem impossible to most everyone on these plains, Cornelius said, and yet most everyone stays. Because leaving is its own kind of impossibility, Annie said. He looked at her again with that unreadable expression, and then he nodded slowly as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. The coffee was ready, and she poured it into the 2 cups. She had the good cup and the everyday cup, and she gave him the good cup without thinking about it, which was the kind of thing you did for a guest without reasoning through it. He accepted it with both hands wrapped around the warmth of it, and for a little while they simply sat together in the kitchen with the fire going and the wind outside and the coffee between them, and it was the most comfortable Annie Wallace had felt in 3 months. He stayed for perhaps another hour. They talked about the land, about the coming winter, about the town of Caldwell and its recent growth since the cattle drives had started bringing Texas longhorns up the Kishom Trail, which passed not far to the west. Cornelius knew more about cattle than about farming, it turned out. He had spent 2 years working as a drover on the trail before deciding that he wanted something that stayed in one place. Annie found herself laughing once, actually laughing, a short and surprised sound, at something he said about a particular ornery longhorn steer, and the sound of her own laugh startled her, as if she had forgotten it was a thing she was capable of. When he stood to leave, he put his hat back on and looked around the kitchen with those attentive eyes. "Your wood supply," he said, which was not a question. "It is getting low," she admitted. "I am going to cut timber tomorrow," he said. "I will cut extra and bring it over." "Mr. Brooks," she began. "Cornelius," he said. "And I'm not asking permission. I'm just telling you what I intend to do, a beat. If that sits right with you." Annie Wallace, who had been managing her own affairs for 3 months and her independence for considerably longer than that, considered the offer. In other circumstances she might have refused it on principle, but the principle of pride, she had learned this autumn, had a lower survival value than the principle of practical wisdom. "It sits right," she said. "Thank you," he nodded. He went out through the door and down the steps, and Annie stood in the doorway watching him climb back up onto the wagon seat. He did not look back as he drove away, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, a particular kind of straightness, the kind that came not from stiffness but from simple integrity, that stayed with her after the wagon had disappeared around the bend in the road. She stood in her kitchen for a long time after, surrounded by more food than she had seen in weeks, and she thought about the strangeness of the world and the way that kindness, when it came, always seemed to arrive from the direction you were least expecting. Cornelius was as good as his word about the wood. He appeared the next morning with an axe and a bucksaw and a work ethic that was apparently without a ceiling, and by the end of the afternoon there was a stack of cut wood beside Annie's house that would, she calculated, see her through the coldest part of winter with some left over. He declined the offer of lunch twice before accepting it on the third asking, and he ate the cornbread. She made cornbread that was extraordinary by virtue of the fact that she had actual ingredients now, with the quiet appreciation of a man who did not take a good meal for granted. Over the meal he told her more about himself, in the unhurried way of a man who was not accustomed to speaking at length about his own life, but who was making an exception out of courtesy or perhaps out of something else that he had not yet identified. He was 32 years old. He had been born in Missouri to a family that farmed a small spread outside of Springfield. There had been 3 brothers, and he was the middle one. His father had died when Cornelius was 19, and the farm had gone to the eldest brother, and Cornelius had gone west because west was where men went when they had no particular reason to go in any other direction. He had worked the cattle trail for 2 years, as he had mentioned. Before that, he had prospected in Colorado for a season and found nothing but cold and discouragement. He had served briefly as a deputy in a small Colorado town before concluding that law work suited neither his temperament nor his understanding of justice in a country where the application of the law was, at best, inconsistent, and at worst, actively harmful to those who most needed its protection. What do you mean? Annie asked, watching him over her coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was sometimes quiet before saying something he had thought about carefully. Law out here tends to serve the interests of the men who have the most, he said. The cattle barons, the railroad men, the land speculators, the small farmer, the homesteader, the family trying to make something out of nothing. The law does not always look their direction. And the Apache, the Comanche, the tribes who have been here far longer than any of us, the law has been nothing but an instrument of taking from them. I could not enforce something I did not believe in. Annie looked at him carefully. This was not, she reflected, the kind of conversation one usually had in a Kansas kitchen in 1873 with a man one had met the day before. But she found to her own mild surprise that she agreed with him, and she said so. Thomas used to say the same thing, she said. He believed the Homestead Act was good for people like us, and it was, I suppose. But he also knew that the land we were farming had been someone else's home not so long ago. He was troubled by that. Most decent men are, Cornelius said. And most men who are troubled by it are still willing to benefit from it, because the alternative is to have nothing, and nothing is very hard to sustain. Especially in October in Kansas, Annie said. Especially then, he agreed, and that near smile appeared again, and Annie found herself thinking that it was a very good face when it allowed itself to relax toward something warmer. Strong in the way that faces worn by honest work became strong but not hard, not closed. He helped her carry the wood inside before he left, and as he stacked the last of the indoor pile he straightened up and looked at her and said, without apparent forethought, "Would it be all right if I came by tomorrow?" Annie's hands were clasped in front of her, and she looked at them for a moment before she looked up at him. For what purpose? She asked, which was not the most gracious response, but which was, given 3 months of hard living and hard grief, an understandable one. To check that everything is well, he said, and perhaps to continue talking. I have not talked this much in several months, and I find that I have missed it. There was something in the last 2 words that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it, a rare thing in a man like this, who gave the impression of being entirely self-sufficient, which Annie was beginning to suspect was both true and incomplete at the same time. "All right," she said. "Come by tomorrow." He did, and the day after, and the day after that. Not every day without exception. There were days when the demands of his own property, which were considerable, kept him occupied from before first light until well after dark, and days when the weather made travel between the 2 properties inadvisable, and days when he sent instead a note carried by his horse-drawn cart with a simple inquiry after her welfare that she found, each time, disproportionately warming. But the pattern of it became, within 2 weeks, a fixture of her days that she would have felt the absence of acutely. They talked about everything and nothing, in the way that 2 people do when they are discovering that the other person is capable of holding the full weight of a real conversation. Annie had been educated. Her father had been a school teacher in Indiana before the family moved to Ohio, and he had taught her with the same thoroughness he applied to his students, which meant that she could read and write well and discuss history and literature, and had opinions about things that went beyond the immediate and practical. She had found in the years of marriage to Thomas, whom she had loved but who had read almost nothing and had little interest in ideas in the abstract, that this part of herself had been quietly packed away like a good dress kept for occasions that never quite arrived. With Cornelius, she unpacked it. He had read, not as systematically as she had, but widely, with the voracious and slightly random appetite of a man who had taught himself largely from whatever books happened to be available in the places where he found himself. He had opinions about Lincoln and Reconstruction, about the railroad barons and the corruption of the Grant administration, about the cattle drives and what they were doing to the land and the economy of the Plains states. He was not a man who held his views tentatively. When he believed something, He believed it with the full weight of his considerable character, but he was also capable of being changed by a good argument, which Annie discovered with some delight when she successfully persuaded him that his assessment of a particular historical matter was incomplete. "You are arguing very well," he said, with an expression that was entirely surprised admiration. "I argue everything well," she said, with a composure that barely concealed the pleasure she was taking in this. "I simply do not always have anyone to argue with." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, not the near smile or the contained amusement, but an actual laugh, full and warm, and it transformed his face in a way that Annie found somewhat startling in its effect on her own chest, which tightened in a manner that had nothing to do with cold or hunger. She filed this observation carefully away, and did not examine it too closely for the time being. November came in cold and mean, with a series of early snow squalls that blanketed the prairie in gray-white and sent the temperature dropping toward ranges that required serious management. Annie was, for the first time since Thomas's death, adequately supplied to meet it. The wood pile held. The food stores held. The cow Bess was giving less milk than ideal, but enough for Annie's needs. She had even, with the extra flour, managed to sell 2 loaves of bread to a passing family heading west, which had given her enough coin to buy a new pair of wool stockings in Caldwell, a necessity she had been doing without for embarrassingly long. Cornelius had his own difficulties that November. The barn at the Harmon place, despite his repairs, turned out to have a foundation issue that made a section of it unstable, and he spent a miserable week in freezing temperatures doing the structural work required to prevent a collapse. Annie brought him lunch on 2 of those days, walking the quarter-mile in the cold with a covered pot, and on the second day she stayed to help him hold boards in place while he worked, which was not pleasant work in the cold but which was effective, and which ended with both of them sitting on overturned crates in the barn, sharing the remaining lunch while their breath made clouds in the frigid air. "You did not have to come and help," he said. "I know I did not have to," she said, returning his own words to him with a look that carried the full weight of its intentionality. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a moment in the peculiar amber light of the barn, where the winter sun came through the cracks in the boards and turned everything gold and shadow. Then he looked away, but not before Annie had seen something in his expression that she had been noticing more frequently in recent weeks, a warmth that went beyond neighborly kindness, an attention that was more specific and more careful than simple friendship required. She was aware of it. She was aware of herself being aware of it, which was its own kind of awareness that she found both unsettling and, if she was being fully honest with herself in the quiet of Thomas's chair in the evenings, not entirely unwelcome. It was complicated territory. She was a widow 3 months out from her husband's death, and the conventions of grief in 1873 were clear enough. A widow was expected to mourn for a period of years before entertaining any notion of remarriage or attachment, and to do otherwise was to risk the kind of social judgment that fell especially hard on women alone in frontier communities. She knew this. She also knew, from the long evenings in which she sat with Thomas's memory and tried to understand what she owed it, that Thomas would not have wanted her to be alone. He had told her so, in fact, in those last lucid days when the fever broke long enough to allow clarity. "You are too good a woman to spend your life empty," he had said, in the plain-spoken way of a man who had no gift for ornament but who occasionally arrived at something precise. She had told him to stop talking nonsense. But she had heard him. She was not ready to think about any of it yet. But she was becoming, she acknowledged to herself, very accustomed to the sound of Cornelius Brooks's voice and to the specific quality of his company, and to the way the days felt shorter and less empty when he was part of them. December brought the worst cold of the year, a blue norther that swept down from the north and pinned the temperature below freezing for 2 weeks without interruption. The prairie was white and featureless, the sky was white and featureless, and the world contracted to the immediate and essential. Annie kept the fire burning around the clock and was grateful for the wood that Cornelius had cut, and for the food stores that lined her kitchen wall, and for the small, stubborn fact of her own survival. He came by when the worst of the storm had passed, on a gray afternoon in the middle of December with snow squeaking under his boots, carrying a covered pot that turned out to contain a beef stew of remarkable quality. "You can cook," Annie said, with a surprise she made no effort to conceal. "I have had to cook for myself for many years," he said. "I have become adequate." "This is not adequate," she said after the first spoonful. "This is genuinely good." "The credit belongs to the rosemary," he said. "I found it growing dried on a south-facing slope last month and cut some before the snow came." They ate together at her kitchen table, something that had become, without either of them formally proposing it, a regular occurrence. The domesticity of it was not lost on Annie, and she suspected it was not lost on Cornelius either, though neither of them commented on it directly. They were circling something, she knew. Something that had been present between them since the first afternoon when she had set the coffee on, and he had sat in her kitchen, and they had discovered, to both their apparent surprise, that they could talk to each other without effort or performance. It was on this December evening, with the fire built high and the wind making its cold pronouncements against the windows, that the circling finally stopped. They had been talking about Christmas, or rather, about the specific melancholy of Christmas in its approach when you were a person who had lost someone, and were not sure how to inhabit the season without them. Annie had said something about how she planned to simply let the day pass quietly, which was perhaps not courageous but was the most honest plan she could make, and Cornelius had been quiet for a moment after she said it in the particular way that meant he was composing something carefully. "I lost someone too," he said. "Not in the same way. Not a wife, but someone." Annie waited. "Her name was Clara," he said. There was an understanding between us. In Missouri, before I went west. She was a good woman, and I thought I would go west and establish something and come back for her. But I was gone longer than I planned, and she could not wait." A pause. "She married someone else. I found out by letter. I do not blame her, but it was a long time before I stopped missing what I had thought we would have." "When did you stop?" Annie asked quietly. He looked at her. "Sometime recently," he said. "I cannot say exactly when." The fire popped. The wind moved across the roof. Annie felt the warmth of the room, of the stew, of the company, and she felt also the particular ache of recognizing that she was at a threshold and that the choice of whether to cross it was entirely hers. "Cornelius," she said. "Annie," he said at the same moment. They both stopped. Then, because she had started it and because she had been raised by a schoolteacher who believed that cowardice of the intellectual or emotional variety was more shameful than most other kinds, Annie continued. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am aware of what has been growing between us. I think you are also aware, and I want to say that I am not frightened of it. Though I think I probably should be, given how recently Thomas died, and given that we have only known each other for about 2 months, and given that by any sensible measure this is all happening far too quickly." Cornelius was absolutely still, with the particular stillness of a man giving his full and undivided attention to something that mattered very much to him. "But I have also learned," Annie continued, "that things happen in their own time and not in the time we would assign them if we were managing the world sensibly. And I think you are a good man, Cornelius Brooks. I think you are a very good man, and I find that She stopped, rearranged, continued. "I find that I think about you when you are not here, and I find that when you are here, the days feel different, more like days and less like intervals between one difficult thing and the next." He was looking at her with those warm, unguarded brown eyes, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before, not the near smile or the contained warmth, but something fully open, something that had dropped all of the careful management he usually brought to his own feelings. "Annie," he said, "I came to Kansas because I thought I was looking for land. I have been here 2 months, and I understand now that I was looking for something entirely different. I did not know that until I found it. A pause. Until I found you. It was not, by the standards of the romantic novels she had read as a younger woman in Indiana, a particularly elaborate declaration. There was no flowery language, no theatrical gesture. But it was Cornelius, which meant it was exactly as true as it sounded, and it landed on her with the full weight of that truth. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in her kitchen in December in Kansas in 1873, with the fire burning and the wind outside and their hands linked on the table. And Annie Wallace felt, for the first time since August, that the world contained not just what had been lost, but also what might yet be found. They were careful after that, careful in the way of two people who have both been marked by loss and understand that anything real is also fragile, and that fragility deserves respect. Cornelius did not press. Annie did not rush. What they had built in the weeks of talking and working alongside each other did not evaporate into the heat of sudden passion, but instead deepened and steadied, the way a river widens as it moves further from its source. He brought her small things. A bunch of dried wildflowers he had found pressed between the pages of an old book at the Harmon place. A piece of quartz he had come across while digging that caught the light in an interesting way. A pattern he had ordered from Caldwell for a dress. He had noticed, he said, without any embarrassment about having noticed, that her everyday dress was wearing thin at the elbows, and he had thought she might like to have the material to make a new one when the spring trading was available. She had held the pattern paper in her hands and looked at it and then looked at him, and the complexity of what she felt in that moment was beyond her ability to articulate. She brought him things in return. She was a better baker than he was a cook, and she had always been good at it, and now with adequate supplies she baked with a pleasure that felt almost celebratory after the months of doing without. She brought bread and cornbread, and in December, when she traded some surplus cornmeal for dried fruit at the Caldwell store, she made a small fruit cake that Cornelius ate with an expression of pure and unapologetic enjoyment. "You are going to ruin me for plain cooking," he told her. "Good," she said. They were learning each other in the way that two adults learn each other when they come to the enterprise seriously and without pretense. She learned that he was an early riser, even earlier than she was, and that he had a habit of taking a short walk before beginning work regardless of the weather, because he found that physical movement in the first light of day organized his thinking. She learned that he was deeply and practically kind, not the showy kindness of a man who wants to be seen being kind, but the quiet and reliable kind that showed up in 100 small consistencies. He never arrived empty-handed. He always noticed what needed to be done before being asked, and he had a particular attentiveness to animals that she found, without being able to fully explain why, tremendously appealing. He learned that she had a stubborn streak that ran in a direct line from her own sense of what was right, and that once she had determined something was right, very little short of an act of God was going to move her from it. He learned that she was funnier than she let on in general company, with a dry and economical wit that appeared suddenly and without preamble, and was all the more effective for its unexpectedness. He learned that she missed Thomas not with the fresh and bleeding grief of new loss, but with the settled and permanent ache of someone who has integrated a loss into themselves, who carries it not as a wound, but as a scar present and real, and not requiring constant attention. He never tried to displace Thomas. He never made her feel that she was expected to be done with her grief or to minimize its legitimacy. When she talked about Thomas, Cornelius listened with the same full attention he gave everything else, and he spoke of him with a respect that she did not take for granted, because it would have been easy and perhaps even natural for a man in his position to feel something less generous. January passed, and then February, which was the hardest month on the plains, not quite as cold as December, but with a grayness and a sameness that could, if you let it, wear down your spirit more effectively than any cold. Annie and Cornelius faced it together, which made it bearable in a way that it had not been the previous year when Thomas was sick and then gone, and Annie was facing the gray alone. In the middle of February, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather had briefly lifted to something almost mild, Cornelius came to her door in a state of what was, for him, considerable agitation. He was not a man given to visible anxiety. His default mode was a calm that Annie had come to rely on as much as she relied on anything, but today there was something in his face that told her something had shifted. "I have been thinking," he said, before she had fully gotten the door open. "Come in," she said. "Tell me what you have been thinking." He came in, but he did not sit, which was unusual. He stood in the middle of her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her and then at the fire and then at her again. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I do not want to continue as we are." Annie's heart did something complicated in her chest. She kept her face still. "Tell me what you mean," she said. "I mean," he said, "that we have been approaching something for months, and I do not want to continue approaching it without being clear about where I am approaching it from." He stopped, tried again. "I love you, Annie. I have loved you, I think, since sometime in November, though I cannot say precisely when, because the feeling did not arrive with any announcement. It simply became true, like the weather changing, a pause. I would like to marry you, if that is something you could want. I am not asking you to decide today, and I am not asking you to set aside anything that you are still carrying from before. I am asking you to consider it." Annie looked at him. She thought, as she often thought in the moments that actually mattered, of what was true rather than what was expected. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the months of this man's company, of the flour and the wood and the beef stew with rosemary and the dried wildflowers from a book. She thought about the feel of his hand holding hers across the kitchen table in December. She thought about what Thomas had said in his last lucid days. She thought about the spring that was coming and what it might look like with this man in it. "I do not need to wait to decide," she said. "I love you too. I have known it for a while, and I have been slow about saying it because I was trying to be sensible. But I find that I am not very good at sensible when it comes to you. I would be glad to marry you, Cornelius Brooks. I would be very glad." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and he took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her. And what happened in that moment between them was not a thing that required narration. It was a thing that simply was, the particular warmth of 2 people recognizing each other as necessary, as chosen, as the answer to a question they had each been carrying so long they had stopped expecting it to be answered. He kissed her, gently and then not so gently, and she kissed him back without hesitation. And when they separated, she kept hold of his hands, and they stood in her kitchen in February with the prairie winter around them, and they were, both of them, smiling. They were married in March of 1874, on a day when the first green was just beginning to push through the brown of last year's grass, when the sky had finally shed its February gray in favor of the particular clear pale blue of an early Kansas spring. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister in Caldwell, a spare and earnest man named Reverend Holt, who had married a great many frontier couples, and who seemed genuinely moved, which Annie attributed to the evident sincerity of both parties rather than any particular eloquence in the proceedings. There were a handful of people present. A neighbor woman named Ruth Chambers, who had brought Annie a pot of soup in the weeks after Thomas died, and who had been, in a quiet and undemanding way, a friend. A man named George Aldridge, who worked the livery stable in Caldwell, and who had known Cornelius since his arrival and was, insofar as Cornelius had a best friend in Kansas, that person. A family named Whitaker, who homesteaded about a mile east, and who had been pleasant and useful neighbors in the manner that good prairie neighbors were. Annie wore the dress she had made from the pattern Cornelius had given her, a deep green that she had paid for with the winter's savings, supplemented by a yard of white collar lace that Ruth Chambers had pressed upon her as a wedding gift. She was not a vain woman, but she knew that she looked well in it, and the expression on Cornelius's face when she came through the door of the church confirmed this without the need for anything to be said. They moved into the Harmon place afterward. It was larger than Annie's house, and Cornelius had by now made it genuinely comfortable with the repairs of the winter months, and Annie brought with her the things that were hers: the furniture, the kitchen tools, the good cup and the everyday cup, the cast iron pan and Thomas's chair, which she placed by the hearth of the new house with a deliberate care that Cornelius understood and respected, never once suggesting that it should be moved or disposed of. Spring came on fully in April, and with it came the real beginning of what Annie thought of as their life. The winter had been a courtship and a promise. Spring was where the actual work started, not just the emotional work, but the literal, physical work of two homesteads that needed to function as one, of soil that needed to be broken and seeded, of plans that needed to be made and argued about and revised and finally agreed upon. Cornelius was a faster and more instinctive farmer than he sometimes gave himself credit for. He had watched his father and his brothers work land for years before going west, and the knowledge was in his hands even when he claimed it was not. Annie had learned farming by necessity, learning from Thomas and from the women neighbors who knew things that no book contained, and she had developed over 3 years a sharp practical intelligence about this particular soil and this particular climate that Cornelius did not have and was wise enough to recognize he did not have. They argued about the planting. They argued about which fields to prioritize and which to rest. They argued about whether to put in winter wheat alongside the spring crops, and about whether to sell best the old cow or keep her through another year, and about a half-dozen other things that a farm generates with perfect regularity. The arguments were, and this was a thing Annie had not expected and found she loved, productive. Cornelius did not argue to win. He argued because he believed something and needed to test the belief against someone equal to the task of testing it, and when Annie's counterargument was better, he said so, and when his was better, she admitted it, and the decisions they arrived at together were invariably sounder than what either of them would have arrived at alone. By mid-April, the first seeds were in the ground. They had planted more ground than Annie and Thomas together had ever managed, because Cornelius had the physical capacity to break soil at a rate that was simply faster, and because Annie had organized the timing and crop selection with a precision that maximized what they had. The spring rains came, nothing like the drought of last year, but steady and reasonable, the kind of rain that made the soil go dark and began the long, quiet business of growth. Annie found herself happier than she had been in years. Not the cautious, provisional happiness of a woman managing a difficult situation with grace, but actual uncomplicated happiness. The kind with physical symptoms, the kind that made you stop sometimes in the middle of a task and simply be aware of how good the present moment is. She woke in the mornings in the new house with Cornelius's warmth beside her and the prairie day beginning outside the window, and she felt something that she recognized, having been without it for so long, as rightness. May arrived with a warmth that softened everything, and in May something else arrived too, something Annie had suspected for several weeks before she was certain enough to say it. She told Cornelius on a May evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch watching the long prairie sunset turn the sky through its extravagant range of color, pink and orange, and the particular deep rose that faded last into the blue of approaching night. "Cornelius," she said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He turned to look at her with an expression that went through several phases in rapid succession: surprise, then a profound and spreading warmth, then something quieter and more serious, as if the weight of the happiness was making itself fully felt. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. "I will know more definitely in another few weeks." "But I believe so." He reached over and took her hand in the way he had taken it across the kitchen table in December, and he held it, and he looked out at the sunset, and Annie could feel from the quality of his silence that he was somewhere deep inside himself, somewhere serious and glad. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel very well," she said, which was true. She felt, in fact, as if the spring had moved inside her along with everything else. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, which was not a gesture he was given to. He was not an extravagant man in his affections, preferring the steady and close over the dramatic, and Annie found herself moved by it precisely because it was not his usual mode. "I am going to be a father," he said, mostly to himself. Then he looked at her, and his brown eyes were as open as she had ever seen them, and he said, "Thank you." "That is a peculiar thing to thank me for," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." And she understood that he was thanking her not just for the child, but for everything, for the loaf of bread left on a stranger's step, for the cup of coffee offered in an empty kitchen, for choosing him when she could have chosen to stay closed, for bringing her whole self forward instead of the careful partial self that grief so often leaves in its wake. Summer of 1874 was different from the summer of 1873 in almost every measurable way. The grasshoppers did not come. The rain came at the right times and in the right amounts. The crops grew with the uncomplicated willingness that well-tended land in a good season demonstrates, the wheat coming up straight and the corn following. Cornelius worked from first light without complaint, and Annie worked alongside him until June, when the heat and her condition made the heaviest work inadvisable. And then she managed the domestic enterprise and the kitchen garden and Bess with a capability that kept them well fed and comfortable through the long, warm days. She read to him in the evenings. She had a small collection of books, 3 novels, a volume of poetry, and a history of the American West that she had found deeply incomplete but intermittently interesting. And she read aloud after supper, while the fireflies began their quiet performance in the darkness beyond the porch. Cornelius was not a passive listener. He interrupted when he disagreed with something, or when a passage struck him particularly, and sometimes the reading turned into a conversation that lasted past the book entirely, and they sat in the warm dark talking until the hour grew unreasonable. This was, Annie thought, the life. Not the word life in the general and expansive sense, but the specific life, the one that a person might mean when they say, "I am glad I am alive," this particular arrangement of person and place and time. She had not expected to find it again after Thomas, and she had not gone looking for it. It had come to her door in the form of a large man with a wagon full of flour and warm brown eyes, and she had let it in, and this was the result. The harvest in September was the best Annie had seen in the years she had been on the Kansas plains. They brought in the wheat with help from the Whitaker family, the whole extended family appearing at dawn with scythes and determination, working alongside Annie and Cornelius through the hot September days in the tradition of harvest cooperation that was one of the better aspects of frontier community life. At the end of 3 days, the wheat was in, and Annie made a harvest supper that was remembered in the neighborhood for some time afterward, not because of any single extraordinary dish, but because of the combination of abundance and company and the particular golden satisfaction of a season's work completed. The baby came in late November. It was a long labor, longer than Annie would have preferred, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Park, who had delivered a considerable number of babies in the Caldwell area, was present from the afternoon through to the early morning hours. Cornelius spent the night in the kitchen, which was where the women had asked him to be, and which was where he remained, unable to sit still for more than 10 consecutive minutes, alternating between heating water when asked and standing at the door to the birth room listening for sounds that would tell him what was happening. What he heard finally at somewhere past 2 in the morning on a cold November night was a sound that was entirely new and entirely definitive, the first full-throated announcement of a new person in the world, a cry that was outraged and unambiguous and absolutely there. Mrs. Park appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is well. You may come in shortly." Cornelius stood in the kitchen and pressed his hand flat against the wall and breathed, which was the most he was capable of for about 30 seconds. Then he straightened up and went to the door of the birth room and tapped on it and went in when Annie's voice told him to come. She was propped up against the pillows, tired in a way that redefined tired, her dark hair loose around her face, and in her arms was a bundle wrapped in the flannel Annie had spent 2 weeks preparing, from which emerged a face that was red and wrinkled and entirely perfect. She looked up at Cornelius when he came to stand beside the bed, and what passed between them in that look was everything that had brought them to this point. The bread on the step, the flour in the wagon, the coffee and the wood and the hours of talk, the March wedding day, all of it leading forward into this room, this night, this specific and irreplaceable thing. "Come and meet him," Annie said. Cornelius sat on the edge of the bed and Annie shifted the baby toward him, and he took his son with the careful and slightly terrified hands of a man holding a newborn for the first time, and he looked down at the small face, and something in his own face did what all the months of difficulty and uncertainty and gradual opening had been building toward. It simply settled into a peace and a completeness that needed no further words. "What shall we call him?" Annie asked. Cornelius looked at her. "I thought if it would sit right with you, Thomas, for your husband. He was part of what brought us to this point. It seems right." Annie's breath caught. She had not expected this, and the unexpectedness of it went through her like a wave. "You would name your son for my first husband," she said. "He was a good man," Cornelius said simply, "and he deserves to be remembered, and I think it is the right name." Annie looked at the baby and then at Cornelius, and she thought, as she had thought many times in the year since he had walked through her gate with a sack of flour on his shoulder, that she had found not just a good man but a rare one, a man whose goodness was not the performance of goodness but the actual substance of it, running all the way through. "Thomas Brooks," she said, trying it. Then she looked at her husband. "Yes, that is the right name." They christened him Thomas Cornelius Brooks at the Methodist Church in Caldwell in December, with Reverend Holt presiding and Ruth Chambers serving as godmother and George Aldridge standing up as godfather, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a bachelor man being handed a baby he is expected to hold with confidence. Christmas of 1874 was everything Christmas of 1873 had not been. The house was warm. The larder was full. There was a spruce branch cut and set in a bucket of sand in the corner, decorated with a few bits of colored ribbon, and the hard candies that Cornelius had brought in the first wagon full of flour, and which Annie had kept, she admitted, not for eating but for sentimental reasons that she was not entirely prepared to articulate. Thomas, the baby Thomas. Their Thomas slept in the cradle that Cornelius had spent November building in the evenings beside the fire, learning the craft from a small book on woodworking and from his own particular stubbornness about doing things well. They sat together on Christmas evening, the baby asleep in the fire built high, with a good supper behind them and the winter outside and the year behind them, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have nothing that requires saying because everything that needs to be communicated between them is already communicated in the simple fact of their presence in the same room. "Do you know what I think about?" Cornelius said at some point in that quiet. "Tell me," Annie said. "I think about you walking down that road with a loaf of bread," he said. "The last loaf, and leaving it for a man you did not know." He shook his head slowly. "I think about what kind of person does that, what kind of person in the worst stretch of a hard season thinks about someone else's hunger before their own. I think about you coming through that gate with a wagon load of flour," Annie said, "for a woman you did not know, who had given you a loaf of bread that she could not afford to give." She paused. "We were both impractical. We were both lucky," he said. "Yes," Annie said, "we were." He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the firelight, and the winter settled around the house with its cold and its silence. And inside the house there was warmth and the small breathing of a sleeping child and two people who had found each other at the last of something, and had made from it the beginning of something else entirely. The spring of 1875 came in with a confidence that seemed to carry the memory of the previous year's good season in it, as if the land itself remembered being treated well and was prepared to respond in kind. The fields they planted expanded from the year before. They had cleared another section over the winter, working together on the cold, shortened days when outdoor farm labor was impossible, planning on paper, and in conversation what they would put in and where, arguing and revising and landing, as they always did, on something better than either of them had started with. Annie had returned to full capacity by March, which was when she decided she was done being taken care of, and resumed her full share of the work with a determination that made Cornelius look at her, with an expression that combined admiration and mild alarm. Baby Thomas was healthy and loud, and had, everyone who met him agreed, Cornelius's jaw and Annie's eyes, which was considered a fortunate combination. George Aldridge came out to visit in April, on a Saturday when the work had lightened enough to allow it, and he sat on the porch with Cornelius and ate Annie's biscuits and held the baby with improved confidence and said, after a while, that he had never seen Cornelius look like this. "Like what?" Cornelius asked. "Like you live here," George said simply. "Like you are actually in the place where you are standing. I have known you 8 years, Cornelius, and you always had one eye on the next horizon. Both your eyes are pointing straight ahead these days." Cornelius glanced at Annie through the open kitchen door, where she was moving about with the efficiency and purpose that characterized everything she did. "I found something worth looking at," he said. Annie pretended she had not heard this, but the color in her cheeks was not entirely from the warm April day. The summer of 1875 was another good one. Not so dramatically good as 1874, with one difficult dry stretch in July that had both of them worried for a fortnight, but sufficient, and the harvest came in respectable and solid. They sold enough wheat in Caldwell to put away a meaningful amount of savings, real savings, money that could be planned around, which was a sensation so novel that Annie kept the account book where she could see it from her chair, and looked at the figure sometimes simply for the reassurance of its presence. In the fall, Cornelius bought a second draft horse, a big red roan he called Cannon, which Annie felt was an unnecessarily dramatic name for an animal whose primary characteristic was placid reliability. And with the second horse he was able to break more ground before the freeze, adding to what they could plan in the spring. Annie taught herself to keep proper accounts, moving from the rough tallies she had kept for Thomas into a more comprehensive system that tracked not just income and expenditure, but the patterns in both. The cycles of cost and return that, once you could see them clearly, allowed for actual planning rather than mere hoping. Ruth Chambers came to visit in October and looked around the farmhouse and the yard and the barn with a thoroughness that Annie recognized as the survey of a woman who is genuinely interested in how another woman has arranged her life. And when she had completed her assessment, she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, "You have made something real here, Annie Wallace." "Brooks," Annie said automatically, then smiled. "Yes, we have." Thomas, the baby, the small and increasingly mobile Thomas, learned to walk in December of 1875, which was an event that produced in both his parents a degree of delighted consternation that neither of them had anticipated. A child who could not walk was demanding in the ordinary ways. A child who could walk was demanding in new and imaginative ways that required total alertness. Cornelius proved to be, as Annie had suspected from the evidence of his attentiveness to animals, a tremendously patient and engaged father, the kind who came in from a full day's work and crouched on the floor to be a horse for a small person to ride without complaint, who told stories at bedtime that were elaborate and inventive, and bore the clear marks of a man who had been thinking them up all day while he plowed. Annie watched him do this one evening in January of 1876, watched him sitting on the floor of Thomas's room with the boy in his lap, telling a story about a horse who could speak 3 languages and a prairie dog who was secretly a senator, with a voice that rose and fell and produced small dramatic effects. And she felt something so expansive and uncomplicated that she had to lean against the doorframe for a moment just to have something solid to hold onto. She had built a life. She had built a life in the worst possible soil, in the worst possible season, from the least promising materials, a widow's last loaf and a stranger's impulse toward decency. And it had grown into this. Into the sound of her husband's voice making her son laugh, into the warm house and the full larder and the expanding fields, into the savings account and the second draft horse, and the plans they made together at the kitchen table that went forward now not just one season but several, because they had something now that warranted being planned for in the long term. Spring of 1876 brought the first real test of what they had built. A family came through, the Parkers, a man and his wife and 4 children who were heading further west and whose wagon had broken an axle 2 miles from the Brooks farm. They showed up at the gate in the late afternoon in considerable distress, and Cornelius went out to them immediately and Annie behind him, and they brought the whole family in and fed them and saw to the wagon and put them up for the night. Over supper, with 7 extra people at her table, Annie looked around the room at Cornelius distributing biscuits to the Parker children with the particular efficiency of a man who was used to making things work, at young Thomas regarding the strangers from a safe distance with enormous and solemn eyes, at the Parker woman's exhausted relief, and she thought of the winter of 1873, of herself alone and running out, of the bread she had baked and given away because she could not give it. The Parkers left the next morning with the axle mended by Cornelius and a supply of bread and dried beans and a portion of the molasses from the stores. The Parker man had offered money, which Cornelius had declined with a simple courtesy that left no room for argument, and the family went west with what they needed and what the Brooks farm could spare, which was, in 1876, a meaningful amount. When they had gone, Annie stood on the porch and watched the wagon recede down the road, and Cornelius came and stood beside her and she took his hand. "You know," she said, "that is the same thing you did for me." "No," he said. "What I did for you was return something you gave first. I gave a small loaf of bread," she said. "You gave a wagon full of flour. You were starving," he said. "I was not." "You did not know that when you loaded the wagon," she said. "You knew only that someone had left you bread and that it was kind and that you wanted to be kind in return." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the empty road. "I knew more than that," he said. "I had seen you, before you left the bread. I had seen you carrying water from the well, and I had seen the way you moved like someone who is managing something that costs them everything. I had seen your wood supply running low. I was going to find a way to help in any case. The bread just told me you were the kind of person worth helping." Annie turned to look at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that a person who would give away her last loaf to a stranger is a person whose house I want to bring flour to, is a person I want to know." He looked at her with those brown eyes that she had been reading for over 2 years now and still sometimes found things in that she had not seen before. "Is a person I want to build something with." She held his hand tighter and leaned her shoulder against his, and they stood on the porch of the house that had been the old Harmon place and was now completely and irrevocably theirs, and the Kansas spring moved across the prairie around them with that indifferent and magnificent abundance that it sometimes produced after a winter well survived. In the summer of 1876, Annie discovered that she was expecting their second child. The timing was good. The harvest would be in before the baby came, and they were in every way more prepared than they had been with Thomas. She felt well, better even than the first time, and she managed the summer with an ease that surprised her, given the heat and the work. Cornelius fussed, which she had expected and which she found, despite her best efforts not to, entirely endearing. He worried about her lifting, and about her being in the sun too long, and about whether she was eating sufficiently and resting sufficiently, and a dozen other things that she addressed with patient thoroughness and occasional impatience, and he accepted both with a good grace that was characteristic of him. The baby came in late October, a boy again, which Cornelius received with evident delight, and Thomas received with a 2-year-old's combination of fascination and deep uncertainty. They named him James, for no particular historical reason, but because both of them liked it, and because it suited the solid, round-faced, immediately comfortable-seeming infant who had arrived with considerably less ceremony than his brother. James Brooks, Thomas and James. 2 boys in a farmhouse on the Kansas prairie, with a mother who read to them from good books and a father who told them stories and taught them the names of things, the names of the stars, the names of the grasses, the names of the birds who came and went with the seasons. The farm grew around them, season by season, in the deliberate and patient way of things that are built to last. New fields cleared and planted. A second milk cow, younger and more productive than poor old Bess, who was finally pensioned off to a purely ornamental existence in the east pasture. An expansion of the house itself. A 3rd room added in the spring of 1878 with lumber from Caldwell, and the labor of several neighbors who came to help in the frontier tradition. The whole thing built over 3 days in April, while Annie kept the workers fed with a hospitality that exceeded, by general consensus, anything the occasion strictly required. Ruth Chambers came for the raising and stayed 2 days, and she and Annie talked the way they always talked, at depth and without pretense, in the manner of a genuine friendship. Ruth had married a man named Chambers in 1875 and was pregnant herself now, and she and Annie discussed the entire landscape of their lives with the frankness that women who trust each other can manage. "You are happy," Ruth said at one point. It was not a question. "Yes," Annie said. "I am genuinely happy. I was not sure I would be again after Thomas died. I mean my first Thomas. It seemed like the kind of thing you might only get once." "And then Cornelius came through the gate with a wagon full of flour," Ruth said with a smile. "He did," Annie said. "He absolutely did." By 1880, the Brooks farm was one of the more established and productive operations in the Caldwell area. Not the largest, there were cattle ranchers with operations that dwarfed what Annie and Cornelius had built, but solid and diversified and well managed, with a reputation in the community for both the quality of the wheat it produced and the character of the people who ran it. Cornelius had become, over the years, someone that other small farmers came to for advice and practical assistance, not because he had set himself up as any kind of authority, but because he was consistently available and consistently useful, and asked nothing in return. Annie had become, in her own right, something of a resource for the women of the area, a woman who had survived the worst that the frontier could do to a person alone, and who had come out of it with her intelligence and her humor intact, and who was willing to share both freely. Thomas, their eldest, was 6 years old and deeply serious in the manner of a child, who has absorbed more of his father's contemplative temperament than is entirely convenient at that age. He went to the school that had been established in Caldwell, walking the 1.5 miles each way with the neighbor children, and he came home with questions that sent his parents to the bookshelf and sometimes beyond it, and he had already an unmistakable stubbornness about what he believed to be right that made his mother smile every time she saw it operating. James was 4 and was, in almost every way, his brother's opposite, loud where Thomas was quiet, immediately happy where Thomas was reserved, the kind of child who made friends with every animal and every person he encountered, with an indiscriminate and slightly overwhelming warmth. He had Annie's eyes and her humor, and when he laughed, which was often, he laughed with his whole body, which Cornelius found so unreasonably entertaining that it was difficult for him to be parental about anything when James was laughing. In the summer of 1880, Annie found herself expecting their 3rd child, and this time there was a girl born in the cold of January 1881, delivered by the same Mrs. Park who had delivered Thomas 6 years earlier, arriving with a decisiveness that suggested she had made up her mind about being born and was not going to be delayed about it. They named her Clara, which was Cornelius's choice, and when Annie asked him about it, he said simply that it was a name he had always liked, and that the old association with it, the woman in Missouri who had not waited, had been replaced entirely by what he had found instead, and that the name deserved to be reclaimed for something happy. Clara Brooks arrived in the winter and immediately began conducting herself as though she owned the house, which her brothers, after a period of adjustment, appeared to accept as the natural order of things. The family they had made, Annie and Cornelius and Thomas and James and Clara, filled the extended house in the way that families do, with noise and with warmth, and with the ongoing, never-completed work of loving and feeding and raising and arguing and laughing and working alongside each other through the seasons. There were hard years and good years, as the plains demanded. There was a locust year in 1882 that stripped a portion of their summer crops and required them to draw on their savings, which was painful but survivable. There was a good year in 1883, when the wheat was so good they sold at the best price they had seen, and Cornelius bought Annie a proper parlor stove that she had been admiring in the Caldwell hardware store's catalog for 2 years. There were cold winters and wet springs, and the endless variety of difficulty and provision that the frontier offered in roughly equal measure to the people who stayed long enough to receive both. Annie and Cornelius stayed. There was never a serious question of leaving for either of them. The roots they had put down in this particular Kansas ground, literally in the fields they had broken and planted and harvested, and figuratively in the community and the friendships and the particular knowledge of this place that came only from years of intimate daily acquaintance, those roots held. Even in the hard years, even when the mathematics of it were tight and the margin for error was small, neither of them wavered about being here. This was where they were. This was where they would stay. In 1884, Cornelius built Annie a proper kitchen, an addition to the house with real shelves and a larger hearth and space to work that she had not had since, well, ever. He spent the better part of that winter planning it, making sketches in the notebook he used for farm calculations, showing them to her in the evenings, and revising according to her suggestions with a thoroughness that made the whole project, by the time it was built in the spring, genuinely hers. She made the first bread in the new kitchen on a May morning with all 3 children watching from the kitchen doorway, Thomas serious and attentive, James excited about the prospect of eating it, Clara trying to climb onto the work table and being redirected twice. Cornelius came in from the fields for noon dinner and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the loaves cooling on the rack and then at his wife at the center of the room she had always deserved to have. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "It smells like the first morning," he said. "When I came through that gate." She looked at him across the kitchen. "The bread I baked then was the last of everything I had," she said. This, she looked at the kitchen, at the shelves full of supplies, at the children in the doorway, at him in the light. "This is the most of everything I have ever had." He came into the kitchen, and he put his arms around her and she put hers around him, and the children made the particular sounds that children make when their parents are being embarrassing, and it was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, which is the exact description of a life that is genuinely good. They grew old in the way that people grow old when they have built something together and have not wasted the years. Not dramatically, not with any sudden alteration, but in the gradual and dignified manner of 2 people who have lived fully in the time that was given to them. Cornelius's dark hair went gray at the temples through his 40s, and then fully gray, and it suited him in the way that the change suited a man whose face had found its final form. Annie's dark hair went gray more slowly and with more resistance, which was entirely in keeping with her character. Thomas grew up into a man who was quieter than most and more honest than practically everyone, and who studied medicine by correspondence, and then in Kansas City, and came back to the Caldwell area to practice, which meant that his parents could look across the distance that most parents of that era had to cross by letter, and visit instead by horse or wagon on a Sunday afternoon. James grew up into a man who ran his own small farm one county over and laughed as much at 40 as he had at 4. Clara grew up into a woman with her mother's stubbornness and her father's attentiveness, and a quality that was entirely her own, a kind of bright and relentless curiosity about everything. And she taught school in Caldwell, which was where she met a young lawyer from Wichita named David, and where her life became properly her own. There was a particular evening, late in the summer of 1895, when Annie and Cornelius sat on the porch of the house they had been building together for 20 years, in the rocking chairs that had replaced the original ones sometime in the late 1880s. The prairie sunset was doing its usual extravagant work, painting the flat horizon in colors that still, after all these years, stopped the breath. The fields were gold with the late wheat. The children were long grown and in their own lives. The house behind them was full of the accumulated presence of a life. The books on the shelves, the kitchen with its good smells, Thomas's chair still by the hearth, worn to the shape of the two people who had sat in it over the years. Annie had her hands in her lap, and she was watching the sunset the way she watched things when she was actually seeing them rather than simply looking at them. Cornelius had his arm along the back of her chair in the comfortable way of a man who has been putting his arm in that particular position for 2 decades and has no intention of stopping. "Do you remember," Annie said, without any particular preamble, "the morning I baked the bread?" "I remember," he said. "I remember finding it. It was the most flour-dusted, most perfectly improbable thing. I stood on those steps and I looked at that wrapped loaf and I thought, who does this?" "A woman who has nothing else to offer," Annie said. "No," he said gently. "A woman who has everything to offer even when she has nothing left. That is not the same thing." He looked at her. "You know that now." She did know that. She had known it, she thought, for a long time, perhaps since that walk back from the Harmon place, when she had left the bread and turned home and felt the specific dignity of having given something rather than having had nothing to give. The sun went down. The first stars appeared in the fading sky, the same stars that had looked down on the Kansas prairie for longer than any of them could reckon, indifferent and beautiful and always there. A barn owl called from the direction of the old Harmon barn, which was now just their barn, the only barn, part of the single property that the 2 homesteads had become over the years. Somewhere in the fields a cricket began its patient work. Annie leaned over and put her head on Cornelius's shoulder, and he turned his face and pressed his lips to her hair, and they sat in the last of the light and were quiet together, which had always been one of the things they did best. Everything they had was here. Everything they had was built from that first impractical gift, a widow's last loaf on a stranger's step, and a stranger's response to it, that wagon coming through the gate loaded with flour, the single most consequential cart of provisions in the history of either of their lives. From those 2 gestures, these 2 people who had both been at the end of something had arrived together at the fullness of what they had always been moving toward. The prairie stretched away from them in every direction, dark now, whispering. The house was warm at their backs. And Annie Brooks, she corrected herself, as she had been correcting herself with pleasure for 21 years. Annie Brooks put her hand in her husband's and held it, and felt the warmth and the solidity of it, and was, completely and without reservation, home.